time passed in a blur. We took up a pleasant enough life, feeding ourselves by hunting and fishing, gathering fruit and honey. We arranged the parts of Dyfed which were near our berth. At first, we all hoped that at every turn in the path we would see a familiar farm or outpost. But as months turned to a year and more, we settled into a passive acceptance. We talked a little, but avoided stories of Dyfed as it was. At night, I could sometimes hear Kigva and Pryderi, who now slept in the next room, talking. I could not hear their words clearly, but Kigva sounded fitful and anxious, while Pryderi tried to soothe her. Rhiannon and I resumed our pillow talk and love-making in time. She was the least perturbed of the four of us about our strange situation. Kigva and Pryderi behaved almost like sleepwalkers much of the time. Rhiannon and I kept them interested in life by reminding them that we must feed ourselves, cut firewood, and so on. But it appeared that Rhiannon relished this new way of life. Perhaps she was glad to be free of the pressures of court, I thought. She laughed quietly. Sometimes I think you understand me. If you don't, then I suppose it's my own fault for not telling you more. When I was still young and not yet queen, I used to ride out daily, as you know. Over time, I rode less and less in the direction of the house of Ternon, and more frequently into the marches of Dyfed. I kept myself concealed, keeping mostly to the wooded places or the lonely places. I followed little streams, watched foxes, hares, and badgers, listened to birdsong. I began to fall in love with this place, with the land of Dyfed. For several years I learned its daily rhythms and its seasonal rhythms. I learned the habits of the farmers and the herdsmen. In time, I was able to move unseen almost everywhere, using my knowledge of those rhythms and aided by the vegetation or the contours of the land. During that last year, I was able to sit under the walls of our berth itself, to follow Puig and his people as they hunted or made their circuits of the cantreves. I came to understand that Puig, as ruler, was the one I must wed if I was to wed myself to Dyfed. His long-standing reluctance to marry or have a son interested me as well. In some ways, I was reluctant too, but it became clearer and clearer to me that I must do this. That perhaps I could help Dyfed in some way. Save it was how I thought of this, that I had to save Dyfed, although from what or for what wasn't at all clear to me. And so, on that famous day which you've now heard about, when I rode so boldly past the seat of our berth, I was riding through a land I knew intimately and which knew me. I had simply stopped hiding. I did that for the love of Dyfed as much as for the love of Puig, to offer my power to the land of Dyfed. So enjoyable was my time with Rhiannon that I knew I was allowing it to make me complacent. I sensed that my own magic would solve nothing here. Perhaps travel was the answer. We certainly needed a change. Kigva and Pryderi seemed glad when I made a strong case one evening that we couldn't go on like this. We had all learned to relish the challenges of our strange self-sufficiency, but I feared that whatever force had done this to us would eventually tire of this game and perhaps do something even worse. Rhiannon was quiet, going along with the plan, but with an obvious resignation. Carrying what wealth we could from our berth, we set out in the direction of Hereford by the southern route. As soon as we were out of Dyfed, everything looked quite normal. It was odd to meet people again, and I was amused to see Kigva immediately fall into her former haughtiness when speaking to peasants or craftspeople. We talked about what we would do in Hereford, and I suggested that we take up the trade of saddlers, in which I had some skill. Kigva was horrified that we would be tradespeople, horrified at the thought of being the wife of a saddle-maker. She was overruled, however, and took it in good part, and so began another strange chapter in our adventure. We found a comfortable house with a workshop and booth at the front, on a street where several saddlers had their premises. Our hands were deft. Pryderi and I did a great deal of the practical work, but Rhiannon had many good ideas about the shape of a saddle, which allowed the horse to move freely and beautifully while carrying it. There was a technique I'd learned from an Irish fellow, which I used to decorate the pommels of the saddles in a deep sea blue. It made our work catch the eye of every passer-by. It didn't take long for our beautiful and unusual saddles to be greatly desired by the nobility and others. It didn't take much longer for jealousy and backbiting to begin among the other saddlers, and accusations of witchcraft weren't far behind. We learned that they planned to take our lives. Kigfa railed at the injustice and insisted that we must fight them. She urged Pryderi to show them the fighting prowess of the Lord of Dyfed. I made her see reason. Rhiannon looked on tiredly. We fled with the money we had made. Twice more this happened. We tried the trades of shield-making and of shoe-making in other towns, but our hands were too skilled and our minds too clever for our own good, and each time we were forced to flee. We decided to return to Dyfed. Perhaps we would find our world restored. We purchased necessities and horses to carry them on, but we needed little. Our berth was still well appointed when we returned, and again we had only to feed ourselves, and so we went back to living innocently off the land. I think we all began to doubt our sanity and the sanity of our companions. What had all our effort been for? I spoke frankly about my worries to Rhiannon, but of the four of us, she seemed most contented. She explained to me that she was glad to be back in Dyfed, and living close to nature as we did suited her well. The land didn't feel desolate to her, she said. We were as well to let things be. At least Pryderi was safe. I had no faith in this safety, however. I could have been happy living like this if we had chosen it, but I still sensed a shadow at the side of my vision. We were watched. I suggested to Rhiannon that we should work some enchantment of our own. Perhaps we could entice our foe out into the open. Rhiannon suggested visiting Ternon in Gwent. He gave me good counsel and assistance before, she said. After I married Puig, I had several pregnancies, which ended mysteriously. I never spoke of this to anyone, least of all to Puig, but I think some of the waiting ladies must have suspected. I would simply go from knowing that I was carrying a child one day to knowing that I was not the next. I had no sickness or bleeding at those times, but I was being watched, and the women began to whisper against me, I think. That's when I went to Ternon and his wife. I needed the counsel of friends who were outside the court, outside of Dyfed. I poured out my troubles to them as we sat together before the fire in their private quarters. Ternon turned to me gently. He asked to bed me. I looked into the eyes of his wife, and she smiled and nodded. I felt no pang of disloyalty to Puig, because I was not in Dyfed, and my feelings for Ternon were as they had always been. When we arose, the three of us ate a simple meal together as the best of friends. Ternon's wife gave me a sweet draught of mead and herbs and honey to drink. I arrived back in our berth before Puig returned from his day's hunting. When I knew I was pregnant again, I wondered whose child I was carrying. That was Pryderi. Posing Rhiannon's wishes was something I never wanted to do, but I found the idea of her travelling alone at this time, which was what she suggested, worrying. I asked her to wait a while. I felt sure that the time we'd wasted making shoes and saddles, the sudden violent anger of our rivals, the disappearance of Dyfed, and even Rhiannon's early troubles had all been a game in which we were gaming pieces. But for whom? I began to go on fishing trips by myself, and while I was fishing, I raised a few mists of my own, taunting whoever was troubling us to show their hand. Had it not been for Pryderi's hounds, my taunting might have worked. One morning, Pryderi and I set out early, hoping to find some quarry enjoying the dewy grass and the first warm rays of the sun. When we saw the white boar, I knew it was uncanny. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood upright. I nudged Pryderi and tried to give him a meaningful look, not wishing to say aloud what I believed to be obvious. This was not a beast of this world, if it was a beast at all. He didn't understand me, thinking I was merely drawing his attention to the thing. We gave chase. It led the hounds, a merry dance, enticing them into thickets, then turning on them when cornered, making it impossible to cast a spear without risking the dogs. Somehow we lost it, then saw it making across open ground at a distance. The dogs chased the boar into a wood we often hunted, trying to keep it on familiar ground. Suddenly we came to a clearing we had never seen before, and there in the clearing was a sort of fortress, which we had also never seen before. It was made of shining white stone, newly cut and mortared. There was a wall of the same stone surrounding the keep, but the gates stood open. I called my dogs to me to lie down, but the boar ran through the open gates, pursued by Pryderi's hounds. We heard them baying for a moment, then nothing. Pryderi made to run after them, but I held his arm. I tried to make him see that this was no ordinary fortress. Some enchantment was at work here, a trap of some kind. This was the only time I ever saw Pryderi close to anger with me. Calling himself Pryderi fa pen Manawydan, he pushed me rudely aside and entered the fortress, calling crossly for his dogs. For my part, I did not enter the fortress. I waited and called after Pryderi and his dogs. I listened. Mist came and went around the place all afternoon in the eerie silence. Before evening advanced, I made for our berth, dreading breaking this news to Rhiannon and Kigva. I knew they would ask why I had not gone after Pryderi, but they were the reason. I felt that I might be getting closer to an answer. If Rhiannon and I might work some enchantment together, we might put an end to this trouble for good. I expected Rhiannon's anger, and thought it would be a matter of letting her calm down, then reasoning with her. However, after she vented her anger, she demanded that I take her to the fortress to see what could be done. When we arrived, she rushed through the gates, calling after Pryderi. Kigva and I watched in horror as the gate of the fortress swung shut with a thud, and the whole thing vanished in the mist. When the mist cleared, the fortress was gone. We searched and called to no avail. Kigva could be haughty and fiery with strangers, but with those close to her, she was more like a whining child. It saddened me to think what kind of indulgent upbringing had made her thus, as she had so many good qualities. However, she made for an awkward companion. First, she was afraid that I would have my wicked way with her. Then, when I assured her that I would be her friend and protect her, she was like a spoiled child, and nothing suited her. She liked the thrill of hunting, but hadn't the patience for the practicalities of it, especially without the stimulation of Pryderi as a companion. After a few weeks of this, I took her in hand and said that we would go back to England, and I would take up cobbling again. I really didn't know what else to do, as I was reluctant to leave her alone for long, but hunting together was so difficult. It wasn't hard to earn a living making shoes, and I was able to pay for a housekeeper, which pleased Kigva. I knew it wouldn't last, and I was right. In less than a year there were complaints against us. Kigva was angry and urged me to stand up to the other cobblers and fight rather than flee, but I sensed that we were wasting our time there anyway. We packed our horses in the dead of night and quietly rode away. The next day I purchased bags of wheat and tied them behind my saddle. We made for home once more. It felt good to return to our berth. Rhiannon's absence was an agony, and yet I felt that she was nearby. Her things were scattered about the rooms. I was determined to put an end to this game and get her back. I did a little fishing and hunting. I was gentle with Kigva and took her along with me. Once we'd stocked the larder, I cleared a piece of flat, low-lying ground and planted 3 small fields with wheat. Kigva watched me as if I'd lost my mind. Bad enough to associate with a cobbler, but a peasant? It was almost too much for her, as if I couldn't possibly be the same nobleman she knew if I willingly did this work. After 2 days of this, I suggested that she find a more pleasant way to occupy herself than watching me, and she did as I asked. I was at the sowing of the 3rd field by this time, and I wove what enchantment I could into that task. Let this grain entice you forth. Let the stalks of this wheat entangle you, as you have entangled Rhiannon and all that she holds dear, I said as I walked up and down with my smock front filled with the wheat. The crop grew well. There was little to do but wait and do a bit of hunting and fishing. The long, hot days arrived, and the crows were beginning to eye the wheat when I decided to begin my harvest. "Tomorrow," I said to Kigva, "I will harvest the 1st field. Will you help me?" She replied that she would do what she could, but in the morning, when we went to the field, the crop was destroyed. The stalks stood broken and stripped of grain. Most were neatly shorn off at the top. It was a field of straw. The 2nd field was untouched and also ripe, so I declared to Kigva loudly that all would be well and tomorrow I would harvest the 2nd field. I wasn't surprised when in the morning the 2nd field had also been robbed of its ears of wheat. If anything, Kigva was more perturbed than I was. I half expected her to take a spear and set off looking for the culprit. I suggested to her that we go to our beds early that night, in order to be in the 3rd field before dawn. As soon as she was sleeping, I armed myself, and taking a lantern and my cloak, I slipped out and went to the field to see what would happen. I hadn't long to wait. I was watching a great harvest moon rise when I heard a rustling in the field. Instinctively, my hand went to the hilt of my sword. Mice! A great horde of mice were in the field. Each one climbed a stalk, bit off an ear of grain, and carried it away. More and more mice flooded in, and the crop was fast disappearing. In a frenzy, I ran through the field, uselessly swinging my sword, shouting oaths at the swarming rodents. As they were reaching the end of their destructive spree, I saw a great, waddling, sleek one who was not as nimble as the others. This one I managed to capture. I removed my glove, dropped it inside, and tied the glove shut. The mouse scratched furiously inside, squeaking loudly. Kigva was awake when I returned. I hung the glove on a peg. She eyed me with her usual look of disappointment. "What have you in the glove?" she ventured. "A thief," I replied, "and tomorrow I intend to hang it as a thief." "My lord?" She looked like she was fearful that I had lost my wits. "Mice, dear Kigva. A host of mice stole our grain away, and I will make an example of this one." "But, my lord, you must not degrade yourself by acting as an executioner, nor handle such a filthy creature." "But I shall, for surely the Lord of Dovehead must see justice done in his own kingdom." She sighed and stirred the fire. Well, I hope you can't wait to hear what happens in the final part of our story next time. I've definitely continued to take a few liberties with the thoughts and motivations of the characters and with the relationship between Tiernan and Rhiannon. But in most ways, I've been faithful to the shape of the story. If you're enjoying this series, I would like to ask you to consider becoming my patron on Patreon. Without that support, your support, I wouldn't be able to keep writing and to making videos. See you next time for the final part of the story.